The Harvard computers were a group of women who worked to classify and catalog the stars of the sky. In the early 20th century, a computer was a person. It was a job. Like how a teacher teaches, a computer computed, and it was mostly women who were computers. In this case, it said the program's director, Edward Pickering, hired mostly women because they could do the job just as good as men. But then also there was the fact that he could pay them much less and have more computers doing more calculations and analyses. Over time, the group came up with a few rounds of ways to classify stars. But eventually, they landed on one developed by Payne-Gaposchkin, who has one of the coolest names ever. It's the basis for how we classify stars today with the OBAFGKM. Payne-Gaposchkin's mnemonic for it was, "Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me," but I don't really like that one because it's not very consent conscious. I prefer "only bad astronomers forget generally known mnemonics," but there's a bunch of good ones. Cannon was said to be able to classify over 200 stars an hour, which is around 3 a minute based on their spectral lines. When you look at a star, you can tell what it's made of by spectroscopy. That's where you separate out light with a prism and measure where certain areas are more intense and certain areas are more shaded because of absorption and emission. Because different elements in different states leave specific patterns in their emission spectra. That's a classic hydrogen spectrum emission, and that's an emission spectrum of iron. Despite all that work analyzing stars and their composition based on their spectra, before 1925 we thought that the sun was made out of pretty much the same stuff that Earth is in the same proportion. That was the year that British-American astronomer Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin figured out and published that the sun was made of mostly helium and hydrogen in her PhD paper. She wasn't a Harvard computer, but she worked at Harvard's own Radcliffe College for Women and was the first person to earn a PhD in astronomy there. So they were at least associated. That's Payne-Gaposchkin there, and that's a Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin there. The idea that the sun was composed of mostly helium and hydrogen was super against the grain of contemporary astronomical thought. So much so that one of her PhD reviewers, Henry Norris Russell, made her tack on a bit at the end that said, "Oh, this is probably wrong and impossible, clearly." But she had checked her shit. Part of her realization was that a bunch of stars that appeared to be showing different spectral lines were actually just helium and hydrogen in different states of excitement, temperature, or ionization. Because in 1920, Indian physicist Meghnad Saha developed ionization theory. And that describes how different elements in different temperatures and states of ionization will show different spectral lines. Cecilia adapted that and found that the sun has 1,000 times more helium and 1,000,000 times more hydrogen than previously thunk. A few years after her PhD was published, that guy Henry Norris Russell figured out that she was right and published his own paper about it. It only had mention of Payne-Gaposchkin and how it agrees with her. But it didn't say she figured this out years ago. And for a long time, quite a few people believed it was him who figured out the composition of the stars. And that misattribution, or straight up denial of women's achievements, is quite the theme, and it shows up practically whenever you're talking about historical women in science.